Hello, welcome to MC and MADD Talk the Civil War. This is episode 21. We're going to be talking about the spy rings in both the Union and the Confederacy. This topic actually, there's not a lot of historians really, digging into this topic, is there, MC? It's kind of one of the lesser known aspects of the Civil War.
Well, there's reasons for that. All right, the first reason for that is it starts with the difference between the Union and the South. The Confederacy ran their intelligence operations as a government operations. They were the first ones to actually create an intel service. All right, basically run under the Secretary of War. In the North, however, it was more of a military commanders type of operation. It wasn't anything set from the government per se for overall intelligence operations. All right. You did have several well-known agencies, specifically the Pinkertons, all right, became the de facto intelligence agency or secret service of the United States, all right, temporarily, all right. But they weren't managed by the government. They weren't managed under the government auspices. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because these records then are privately held. There's no governmental group that was holding onto the Union ones. In the Southern ones, yes, there was a lot of papers. So there was a lot of information that could have been gleaned from them. But of course, much of that was burned, right, when the government fled Richmond after the falls of Petersburg. All right, so a lot of the documents that would be wonderful from a historical standpoint basically went up in flames. All right, with this Confederate operations, and it's unfortunate.
Well, there is a reason for that, though. They weren't going to surrender yet. All right, they burnt what they couldn't take with them, and they hightailed it out of Richmond.
No. I don't. There's no reasons for that. I have no problem with that at all. I mean, to be honest, one of the greatest Union spies was that Elizabeth Lou, right? And she requested all of her correspondence back from all these different government officials and burned all of them, all right, to make sure that any of the people that were working with her weren't outed, to protect her sources. All right, so that's another thing that happened, of course, because both sides were, quite frankly, using people that would be considered traitors by the other side.
Yeah, exactly. And even with the fall of the Confederacy, you still had Confederate sympathies in the South. Obviously, the war had just ended. I mean, if it would have been.
You had axes to grind. People had lost loved ones. If it was found out that their loved one died in a battle because information had gotten to the other side, all right, due to a specific spy, there would have been retribution. I mean, we weren't. People think that the Hatfields and the McCoys are, some kind of special thing. Well, they're the remnants of what we used to be more than anything else. That kind of, homespun grudges that were taken out. That was a part of Americana for a long time, and you would have had those kind of activities, barbaric type of activities that there may have been, revenge taking place for decades afterwards if some of that hadn't happened.
Well, and even with the papers being burned, that still happened. Reconstruction, anybody?
Well, I mean that was Reconstruction is a little bit different. We'll get to Reconstruction when we get there. But but it is the thing to think about, though, is that the United States and the Confederacy began the war without really any kind of organizational basis for intel gathering. All right, it tended, even when they did start the spying grouping, it tended to be, for the most part, at least initially, based around troop movements. And in fact, the troop movements for the Union were basically during the Battle of the First Bull Run were basically outed to the Confederacy from their spies, which is why they were able to move as rapidly as they did.
Well, yeah, and even as the secession crisis is moving through, you already have people turning on their governments. Okay, so like in Washington, Virginia has yet to secede, but yet there's already a spy ring being created in the DC area. That's one of the things I did read out of that PDF you shared with me.
Yeah, and there's also a counter espionage work by the Pinkertons already being undertaken even before Lincoln is inaugurated. And in fact, one of the Pinkerton becomes, for all intents and purposes, the spy master until McClellan is removed from office. And the reason for that is McClellan is the one who basically hired the Pinkertons to be his intelligence services. And he, of course, approached it differently than many other people because the Pinkertons were a detective agency. So they were doing detective kind of work to try and, in their kind of spying kind of thing. They were also doing infiltration work as well. And it was Pinkerton's infiltration work, all right, that actually prevented several legitimate conspiracies to assassinate Lincoln before the inauguration.
Well, I was under the impression that the plots were mainly kidnapping plots at the beginning of the war. It wasn't until 63, 64 when the Confederacy finally said, fuck it, kill him.
There were assassination plots on Lincoln from the moment he won the election. People started plotting to kill him. And there were several that were legitimate plots. Not the least of which was one of the Confederates, the National Rifles, right, were infiltrated with a bunch of Confederates and in Baltimore. And Pinkerton knew about this because he had placed an agent in there, all right, and it was through his efforts that the National Rifles around Baltimore became the actual. They basically were able to purge all the people with Confederate sympathies to create a hardcore for the defense of Washington.
Yeah, and I find it rather surprising that the Confederacy ran a lot of their spy networks out of Toronto, up in Canada. What's your take on that? Was that smart?
I don't think that it was that they were necessarily running it out of Canada. It gave them a safe place deep in the quote unquote Union territories to do certain things. Right. One of the biggest advantages on both sides was because newspapers were what they were. Right. People were talking all the time in newspapers, and so learning what was going on from newspapers, having people read northern newspapers was quite important to them. All right, to see what the sympathies were like, how it was playing on the home front, etc. A lot of information can be gathered like that. Okay, so of course Toronto is in Canada. The United States obviously is saying, we can't invade Canada unless we want to go to war with Great Britain. Okay, so it was a safe spot for them to operate, and get information easily back and forth across the border. Right, so it makes a lot of sense to do that.
Yeah, but it's so far away from Richmond. Actually getting valuable information and intelligence back down across the Mason-Dixon, it had to be quite difficult, from Toronto of all places.
Well, the advantage, of course, of what valuable intelligence are you getting out of Toronto? You're not getting the intelligence out of Toronto so much as you're able to move. It's an infiltration place. You're able to get strategic kind of intelligence, but not tactical intelligence. Any move, like troop movements, things like that, which is what, for the most part, the both sides remained focused on throughout the war, right? But the strategic side of what was going on generally, all right, could be gathered there. But for the most part, the great advantage of having that there is, well, someone's coming from Toronto, okay, there's going to be fewer restrictions on them. They're not going to be looked at from or scrutinized nearly as heavily. All right, if your agents are coming from Toronto, and then okay, an agent gets found out, right? But he learns that he's been spotted, or he learns that they're coming to get him. All right, well, you can try to go south, but they're looking for you to try and go across the border to the south. If, however, you escape into Canada and go north, there's going to be fewer barriers. You know, if you're going deeper into the north, they're not expecting that. It's harder to track you. Right? See, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess you could also you use couriers and stuff like that. So it's not one guy going from Toronto to Richmond. It's you're having dead drops and you're moving information that way. So
right. Well, there's several different methods. Dead drops, different people, multiple people moving things along a line. You know, it's never just one. Like you said, it's never just one individual. It's a whole slew of individuals.
All right. Well, let's dig into this a little bit. I'm guessing you had a better look at that PDF file than I did.
Of course, I read it all the way through.
Yeah, exactly. So do you? Yeah, go ahead and start disseminating it a little bit.
Well, one of the things that I found that I didn't know about, right, and that I was very, very, very much interested in was a guy named Webster. All right. Now, Timothy Webster is a man who is picked by Pinkerton, and he's the first initially. He's one of the people that he picked to infiltrate the National Rifles, right? And he's one of the ones that he got information about some of the assassination plots that were taking place, right? They were able to make sure that Lincoln was able to go through his inauguration, right? Now, but that wasn't all. When Pinkerton found out that the Confederacy was running their own little spy rings, he set up a counter surveillance spy and sent Webster to the South, all right, to be a spy. And in fact, during his trips back and forth across the Potomac, all right, he actually learned that a Maryland secessionist had been jailed when he had attempted to cross into Virginia. Webster actually intervened, convincing the Union officer that was holding the guy, his name was Camelar, all right, to let him go, and he did. And of course, people were like, "Wow, we really like Webster. Webster is on our side." And Southern sympathizers on both sides of the river then, started to support him. Webster at this time didn't even realize that Camier actually was an agent for the Confederate Secret Service Bureau. But after talking to him, Judah Benjamin, all right, the Secretary of War for the Confederacy, accepted him as a courier and was actually handing him information as a courier for the South.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's just funneling the information directly to the Union.
And so basically these reports were going directly to Pinkerton as to what was going on. However, unfortunately, all right, in February of 62, Webster's report stopped. So Pinkerton, concerned about his agent, sent two of his other agents to go see what happened. And what they found out was that Webster just had gotten ill with rheumatism and was laid up in a hotel, and that he was being cared for by another one of the Pinkerton agents, actually, but she was a woman named Hattie Lawton and her black slave. All right. The unfortunately for Webster, the two agents he sent down there, that Pinkerton had sent down there to find out what had happened, were Price and Scully. And both of these operatives were well known as Pinkerton agents by the Southerners. So basically, he was outed because they said, "What are these Pinkerton agents going to visit this guy for?" And that's when they found out that Webster was a Pinkerton agent.
He ended up getting tried as a spy, right, and killed.
He was tried as a spy, and he was hung. He was killed. And of course, throughout the war, if you were caught as a spy, for the most part, you were hung, unless you were a woman. Now,
even then, I think there was a couple women that were spies and
no,
actually executed.
no woman was ever executed as a spy. There were women that died, women spies that died in for a variety of reasons, but none of them died because they were executed.
Oh, okay.
Unless you refer to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, but then you can't say that it was a spy. Then you can just say it was part of an assassination plot.
Well, no, and that's something I did want to dig into a little bit as well. Supposedly,
We'll get to that. Well, let's hold off on
okay.
that because that's later in obviously toward the end of the war. So I kind of want to.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, go ahead and continue then. Yeah.
So, and while McClellan remained the man in charge of for the Union forces, right? Pinkerton basically was running his spy rings, all right, in the South, and of course the Southerners were running their own spy rings. They had several people, all right, that were spies, not the least of which is Belle Boyd, all right. She's the one that that everyone knows, that has heard about, right? That was supposedly running the operation out of even into her cell when she was in her cell, when she was caught. Now, what's interesting is Pinkerton basically outed her quite rapidly. All right, although she had done a lot of damage because she was one of the ones that had given information to Stonewall Jackson on the first Battle of Bull Run. All right, so there were several things that happened. Now, she herself was caught, and then eventually she was released and then sent to Richmond, right, where she was, of course, a great hero. And that's generally what they did with a lot of the women. If they caught a woman spy for the other side, they would just kind of generally go, "Okay, get out."
Okay, yeah, because Jensen was wondering what they did with the women that were captured as spies. He actually asked that directly. So,
well, what's interesting is generally when a woman was caught, for example, the woman that I mentioned that was taking care of Webster and her black slaves. Now, the South had a huge blind spot because they believed that a slave couldn't possibly be a courier or a spy. Now, I don't know why. I'm not sure why you had that viewpoint.
Well, I think they had that. I think they had that view because even just the travel in the South, you had to have documentation if you were a slave, right? So it would be rather difficult for a slave to actually have freedom of movement within the Confederacy.
Yeah, but it's like, okay, but it's silly. Okay, it's just ignorant. All right.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree with you because, yeah, who else would have more of a motive to fucking betray you than somebody you're holding in bondage?
Exactly. Especially considering that, whether you like it or not, when slaves were sold from one master to the next, that master that just purchased that slave, even if he was, let's say that he wasn't the kind of vicious, brute that other people were, you don't know if the master previous was, though. Did you get that guy when he from a brutal master, who has his views? You don't know what you're actually, what that person has gone through, so what their viewpoints are going to be. So, for example, though, Lawton was arrested, all right, as a spy, all right, but of course her slave was let go. All right, now Lawton, did she go to prison? Well, after a while, I think they put her in prison just temporarily, but for the most part, they were placed under house arrest. All right. I mean, they weren't really imprisoned per se. I mean, they couldn't go without they couldn't go away on their own, right? They couldn't travel on their own or anything, but at the same time, they were, they're just under house arrest until they're sent back home.
Well, yeah, they were just deported pretty much, right?
Right. All right. And they would do several different things. Now, another one of the big spies for the South, right, for the women in the South, was Greenhow. Rose O'Neill Greenhow. All right. And she was openly pro-slavery. All right. She wept at the gallery in January 21st in 1861 when Jefferson Davis said farewell in the Senate. All right. She was a well-known socialite. She had all of this information. She was the one who actually was running the supposedly
DC,
still
right?
giving information after things. But Pinkerton, of course, arrested her, found her with cipher devices and everything else right in her house. And what did he do? He basically put her under house arrest. And even while she was under house arrest, Pinkerton was, of course, monitoring who was visiting and who wasn't visiting. And many of these people were, high government officials, right? Well-known government officials, not the least of which were some of the people that were on the Secretary of War, right? On the committees of war in the Senate. She was well known. Now, eventually, she is actually placed out of house arrest because people are bitching that how can you let this woman not go to jail? And they put her in jail, right? Which is where the stories of her passing the notes through the prison bars and everything, throwing balls. To be honest, it's hard to say whether or not that's accurate or not, because there's not any real evidence per se left. Could it have happened? Possibly. A lot of people say no, because her prison cell had no access to the window in her cell wasn't open to the fields. It was open internally.
Yeah, okay. But if she was a highly respected member of the community and in all these influential circles in DC, she could have easily just paid to have anything taken out by a guard, right?
Well, or a guard or a visitor, or it could have. It's very possible that she was gathering information that way. Apparently, she was, good looking. All right, quite charming. Apparently, it's amazing. Now, unfortunately for her, Pinkerton, when he found out who she was and he was monitoring her, also was able to find out who several of her couriers were, right, including the officers that were assigned to the provost marshal's office, right, which they then nabbed and executed. Now, she has an interesting career because they send her back back south. They send her back across the border. She leaves on a mission to go to Great Britain, actually, right, to try, to secure as much, support for the Confederacy from Great Britain. And in fact, she ends up on her way back trying to dodge the blockade.
The blockade
runner. Yeah. Unfortunately for her, the blockade runner runs aground on a sandbar. All right. She attempts to flee in a boat. The boat, it's kind of a stormy night. She attempts to flee in a boat. The boat is one of those small little boats, overturns, right? She's dumped in the water and she drowns. Of course, the reason she drowns is her inside of her clothing has sewn $2,000 worth of gold that she was bringing to help support the Confederacy.
Oh, damn.
So as a result, she drowns. Now her daughter, who was also one of the people that was helping her, and her daughter initially at the start of the war was only 8 years old, she actually survives the war, and actually, it's through a lot of her stories that she's learned about.
I wonder where she secured the gold from, if it was actual British government gold, or if she just did fundraisers in London or whatnot.
Hard to say. All right. She is they do find her. They do find her body, and of course she's buried in a state funeral. And this is in 1864. as being one of their gallant heroes who sacrificed for the cause. And she was definitely one of the people that was willing to, you know, die for the Confederacy. And that, all these spies basically were willing to die for the cause. All right.
Yeah, that's something I kind of wanted to get into also, is it was more dangerous to be a man and a spy than it was a woman, obviously, because the men were hung pretty much immediately, right?
Well, that's true, but you also got to remember, when it came to women, women had other issues, right? Maybe you weren't executed, but just the kind of social ostracism, all right, that could take place was enough to convince many of them to commit suicide. All right, so I mean, there were other forms of pressure from society that were placed on women during that time frame. Yeah, men would get shot, okay, all right, but the women generally could face other fates, right? Not the least of which, well, a lot of people don't like to talk about this. The reality is when you're captured by an enemy force and you're a woman, you're at their mercy. Now, for the most part, they were treated respectfully, but I can tell you that wasn't always going to be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. What
Especially
do you think
if
would
you
be
were black?
what was more dangerous, to be a soldier on the front line or to be a spy, you know, in DC? Let's say you're a Confederate, you're in Washington DC running a spy ring. Which one is more hazardous to your health?
It depends on how you got to remember how people were looking at it and what they considered an actual spy versus scout. Okay, scouts were part of the military. They were formally in uniform generally. They had a service. You know, they had a support service. They were directly subordinated to the troops. Generally, if you were one of those troops, you're going through lines, and you could be outed at any point in time or shot just from a picket when somebody, even if it's your own side, you know, not realizing who you were from a dangerous side. So it was quite dangerous from that aspect. So when you talk about a soldier in the battle, well, it kind of depends on which battle and where you were when that part of the battle was taking place. Some of the areas, you know, if you were part of the battle in Shiloh, right, at the Hornet's Nest, I think it was probably more dangerous to be at the Hornet's Nest, all right, than a spy. But over the long term, all right, the threat to you, the constant threat, the constant pressure of going back and forth across the lines between the North and the South was quite hazardous. So I don't want to say one was more dangerous than the other. It just kind of depended upon the situation.
Different types of hazard. I get your point. But the thing is, though, if you're a spy in DC at this point, right? Let's say it's 62, right in the middle of the fighting, right? You don't know when the Pinkerton detectives are going to show up at your door in the middle of the night, drag you out, and hang you. I mean, well, that would be.
They wouldn't drag you out and frame you. They would drag you out and throw you in prison, and you would be tried by a military tribunal.
And then hung. I mean, it's just
if you were found to be a spy, you were hung. Yes. But for the most part, Pinkerton. I mean, he ran a very. They were a detective agency. He hired detectives. Some of his detectives were women. All right. Which was obviously an unusual choice for that time frame, right? The majority of his detectives, of course, the majority of his agents were men, but he did have women agents as well. So he was quite broad-minded when it came to using whatever tactics were necessary.
Well, and I would think the Confederacy would use a lot more women as spies than the Union, for the simple fact they, you know, most of their men of fighting age were out in the field fighting. I mean, what other tools did they really have other than
once again, one of the things you got to remember is the North never. I mean, yeah, you had Pinkerton, right? All right, until McClellan is sacked, and he's running operations, but it's from the military perspective. In the South, the Southerners are trying to set up, you know, regular communications lines. They're trying to set up a regular intelligence agency that's far broader in scope, with one notable exception, and this goes back to England. Okay, the U.S. government, of course, knew very well, all right, that the South was being given ships. All right, that the British were building ships for them, and they made several attempts, all right, to make sure that those things were limited, all right, that activity was limited as much as possible, all right, and slowed down as much as possible, or even didn't take place. Now, they weren't able to prevent the CSS Alabama from sailing, but they were able actually to note several British sailors who came back, all right, who were then bragging about how they were they were a part of this, all right, and they followed them to two more ships that were under construction, and the U.S. government was able to force the British government to not actually hand those over, all right, to the Confederacy. One of which was a full-blown ironclad.
Oh, no, I'm still here. Go ahead and continue, MC. I'm taking a look at that Wikipedia article here about the Confederate Secret Service. I wanted to bring up some more points. So looking for a few things real quick.
That's all right. So the other thing about that was interesting is the CSS Alabama was the most successful of all the raiders, commerce raiders. The CSS Alabama actually captured approximately 60 ships. All right, 60 merchant ships. So at this time, 60 merchant ships is, I mean, that's a massive haul. That's a lot of revenue. All right, that you've disrupted between the U.S. government and Europe. Right. However, it was also the intelligence agency that was working out of the British government, and the British government actually started complaining that there was too many U.S. spies in London. The U.S. spies were watching everything. All right.
Oh, I can imagine Confederate and Union spies probably everywhere in that bitch.
They actually started complaining about it, but it was one of the Union spies that actually let the Kearsarge, which is the ship that actually fought the Alabama and sank it, that actually let the Kearsarge know where the Alabama was, so it could lay off the coast and force the action, which took place off the French coast. It was a 2-hour engagement, which for whatever reason, people like to watch these things. So a lot of people from the coast came out to watch this battle take place. And of course, then came the recriminations because, of course, most of the sailors were not Southerners. They were British.
Yeah, well, and I think Jensen and Cabby are still in the chat. I take back everything bad I've ever said about, the UK. Thank you. Thanks for your help, guys. But no, I'm looking here at it is Wikipedia, so bear with me. But the Confederacy's first Secret Service agent may have been James Bullock in '61. Almost immediately after the attack on Fort Sumter, he traveled to Liverpool, England, to establish a base of operations. Britain was officially neutral in the conflict between North and South, but private and public sentiment favored the Confederacy. Britain was also willing to buy cotton that could be smuggled past the blockade, which obviously we've talked about the blockade before. Okay, so it was Bullock who purchased the CSS Alabama, as well as many other blockade runners. So I think it was Bullock that you were talking about, that was running the operation out of England, yes. Right?
Yep. Yes, it was. And like I said, the Union forces knew who he was. And they were keeping tabs on him. And it's by following him that they learned about some of the other commerce raiders that they were able to stop.
Yeah, and just the fact that we know his name means he wasn't the best spy in the world, right? I mean, we shouldn't know who you are, buddy.
Well, you know who Pinkerton is, right?
Well, I know most of my information about Pinkerton comes after the war when he was harassing Jesse James. but we'll get to that whenever we end with the war. What's interesting, though, this Wikipedia article is trying to say that MUD was in the Confederate Secret Service. I don't necessarily even see a connection between John Wilkes Booth and the Confederate Secret Service other than this. He went to Canada twice during the war. He might have been meeting with Confederate agents in Toronto, but we don't know for a fact.
No, we don't know. We don't know if he was truly a Confederate agent or whether or not he was just, one of the people who was considered sympathetic toward them. It's obvious that they could have that if they needed to, John Wilkes Booth would have been more than amenable to house or hide Confederate spies if they so necessary. If it was necessary to do so, that he would be he himself would be more than happy to provide a safe haven, per se, like a safe house, if he could. I mean, he did. He always had Southern sympathies, but he never actually took any kind of real action. All right, until basically his assassination of Lincoln.
Yeah, and John Wilkes Booth was famous, all right? He was the Tom Cruise of his day. So, really, I mean, if he showed up at Mudd's house right after the assassination, how would Mudd even know that John Wilkes Booth did the assassination? Word wouldn't have spread that quick yet. So I don't necessarily think Mudd deserved what he got, actually.
I would tend to probably agree with you that he himself was probably could not have or should not have necessarily been hung as a co-conspirator. But then again, he probably wouldn't have been if he had immediately after he found out about it told the authorities, hey, I just saw this guy. I didn't know what had happened. He asked for help, and so I gave him help. If he had reported it rather than the other way around, right, where they tracked it back to him, it probably would have gone differently.
And I mean, isn't that where they came up with the phrase "Your name is Mudd"? Was literally because of that dude.
I think there probably is a connection. Yes.
Unfortunately. Yeah, no, and you almost feel bad for the guy. Almost. I mean, you're right. He should have been like, wait a minute. I saw John yesterday. He told me he went that way.
It's hard to say whether or not he was actually a part of the plot. Even the one guy's mother, who does get executed, she's the only woman who was executed for the assassination. All right, and it's one of the few women that were ever hung in America. There is evidence that possibly she didn't know what was going on, but then again, it was her boarding house where they were having meetings that they felt was a safe house, etc. So to say that, to assume that she knew about this or was part of the situation, it's reasonable. Is it beyond a reasonable doubt to assume that she wasn't taking part in this? Well, even if she wasn't taking part, what did she do to stop it? And that's really why a lot of that reaction came about.
Let's talk a little bit.
I'm not trying to justify it. I'm just trying to go.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I do want to talk a little bit about the plot itself. Did it even have a chance of success? And yeah, I know they got Lincoln, but they didn't finish the rest of the plot. They were supposed to decapitate the Union by taking out Abraham Lincoln, Secretary of War Stanton, and the Vice President, right?
Yeah, but there was what difference would it have made?
That's my point. Was this just
the South? Yeah. The South was materially not able to continue the war, even if the situation, and this is something people, if you take a look at the reaction after the facts, all right, you would have seen a similar type of stealing of resolve, all right, if it had happened in 1861 or 1862, okay.
Yeah, well, that's why I make. That's why
it technically would not have made any difference in the war, in the conduct of the war at all.
Well, that's why I make the joke. The only thing wrong with John Wilkes Booth is he was 3 years too late. I actually think there's some truth to that. If the assassination would have happened in 61 or 62, it could have actually accomplished its goal, because you had McClellan running for office and he wanted to end the war anyway, right?
It wasn't going to accomplish the goal, because it would have changed the entire dynamic into, now we're going to punish the South. What you would have saw was Union reaction would have been to drive the Southerners. It would have turned into a scorched earth policy on anything in the South across the board.
What if McClellan would have won, though, with the absence of Abraham Lincoln?
It wouldn't have been. He wouldn't have won. Are you kidding me? The sympathy vote would have ended anything like that. If it would have happened, if it would have happened when McClellan had already been left as the army, if McClellan was the commander, all right, when it happened, he never would have left the army, more than likely. All right.
Well,
he would have changed. It would have changed a lot of things very quickly. There would not have been. I'm telling you that what you would have seen is an uprising immediately in the North to provide troops on a scale the South could not even comprehend. There wouldn't have been a question. One of the things that may not have happened is the Emancipation Proclamation may never have happened. But as far as the South being punished, the South being destroyed, no, it'd have been far worse.
Do you think the Emancipation Proclamation wouldn't have happened? I happen to think, especially with your line of thought here, that it would have happened, and it would have happened quicker, because you would have had radical Republicans sweep into office after the assassination of Lincoln, and he was quite a moderate Republican at the time, not necessarily
but the war, there wouldn't have been an Emancipation Proclamation. Would they have declared that all slaves were immediately free? That's a possibility. Okay, that's a definite and real possibility, that they would have said, fine, all slaves are free, and that's the end of it, and then just gone in hog wild. But the overreaction of the people in the North, it would have been severe.
What about the kidnap plot?
And believe it or not, a lot of people don't realize this, but the reaction of the South for the assassination of Lincoln is quite telling. There were no freaking parades. People weren't celebrating it. Because
but they weren't mourning it. They weren't mourning either. They weren't. There was instances where they were forced to go in the mourning.
It affected their honor and would have affected the morale of the troops.
What about the kidnap plot? There was 3 separate plans drawn up by the Confederate Secret Service to kidnap and ransom back Abraham Lincoln in exchange for ending the war, basically. Could that have worked?
Never would have happened. Come on, how are you gonna? Why? These are fanciful things. Okay, how are you going to get Lincoln out of there? You're going to have to try and hold him as a hostage. Lincoln himself, believe it or not, Lincoln himself was not somebody you could just capture. Okay.
Yeah, what was he, like 6'5" or something? Like, this dude was pretty big.
And he was a well-built man who grew up very much like Jackson did, kind of scrapping. Okay, so he wasn't going to go down. It wasn't going to be just, get in the carriage. Okay. Lincoln himself was well able to take care of himself. He wasn't somebody that he wasn't this mousy little wallflower.
Now, and even if it did succeed, right? Okay, they kidnap President Lincoln. There's no guarantee that the vice president is going to go ahead and do the exchange.
They wouldn't have. There wouldn't have been anything like that.
And wouldn't that put a giant target on Jefferson Davis's chest?
Sure, it would have.
Right?
Of course, it would have.
Yeah, and at that point, now you're taking pot shots at the president of each country. I mean, the international community itself would be in shock, wouldn't it?
Well, what the international effect would be, I don't know how they would have reacted to it.
I think England would have been terrified. They would have been.
Well, they definitely would have signed. They definitely would have said, "We don't want any part of this."
Yeah. Can you imagine?
Heathens, they're like the freaking Native Americans. They're just like the Indians, those savages. That's what they would have came back with. I guarantee you that.
Yeah, and I could see, I believe it was a king at the time. I don't remember exactly who was king or queen in the 1800s in England. But I'm pretty sure that, the crown would have been quite shocked and appalled that a kidnapping.
In the 1860s, I think Victoria had already ascended.
You might be right. Like I said, I have no idea off the top of my head.
I think it was Queen Victoria. I could be wrong about that, but I think that, I mean, she reigned for 70-something years. So,
hey, Jensen or Cabby, you want to tell us?
I mean, I'm not exactly.
You want to tell us who it is in the chat?
Up on British history. It's royal this, royal that, king, queen, every now and then. British history.
Yeah, Jensen, if you want to let us know who was king or queen in 1860s, that'd be cool. Anyway, we haven't really discussed the Union spy networks all that much. We've been kind of focusing on the Confederacy. What kind of spy networks did they have in Richmond? I know we've talked about before that one of the slaves of Jefferson Davis was actually a spy for the Union, right?
Yes. Which is very true. The main spy was Elizabeth Lou. All right, she was running. She had a number of different people that were giving her information, and she was recruiting various different people as her couriers or as her agents. All right, including one of the people who was part of the logistics. All right, for the Confederacy, who actually succeeded in delaying a lot of the support going to Robert E. Lee in Petersburg and so forth. All right, one of the rail guys.
Jensen, thank you. He said it was Edward, okay. Albert Edward, 9th November 1841 to the 6th of May 1910. So it was King Edward the 7th, I think. I don't know. I suck with Roman.
When did Queen Victoria reign?
I'm not sure. Yeah, my son heard me say Edward. That's one of his middle names. He's stop saying my name, Dad. Anyway, no, and she was the one that lived by Libby Prison, right? Three blocks away from one of the biggest Confederate prisons in the South.
Yeah, she was, and she was, she was similar to the Green. What's her name? Greenhow. Similar to Greenhow, she only for the Union side. All right. She came from a wealthy family. She was well known in Richmond society. One of the differences is she was an ardent abolitionist. People knew about her ardent abolitionist sentiments. In fact, she convinced her mother to free the family slaves. All right.
See, that's something I want to ask you. Okay. When we're talking about her, she was an abolitionist. Everybody in the community knew it. Don't you think they would have known she was a spy? And the same could be said for the woman that was a Confederate spy that we were talking about at the beginning of the show. They knew that she had Southern sympathies. Why did it take them so long to arrest her? I mean, it seems like these people are hiding in plain sight.
Well, you got to remember that this is, at this point in time, you got to understand how society worked. Society was completely different. Okay. The view of women, all right, was that they were something to protect, that they were something that were sacrosanct. And the higher a woman got in society, all right, the more of that credibility that they would have, the more stigma would be attached if something happened to them. All right, from a negative standpoint, they became more precious, like Fabergé eggs in a lot of ways. And yes, they were you would think that people would know that these are dangerous people to keep in mind, but the society viewed women differently than we viewed it today. There was also the aspect of the American Civil War that it is a gentleman's war. Now, warfare is not gentlemanly in and of itself, but the people that were conducting it were people that knew one another. They didn't. A lot of the vitriol and stuff that people, certain individuals carried with them. All right, those were the exceptions for the most part. They weren't necessarily the rule. All right, it's hard to get people to understand that when you're trying to shoot the other person, you don't have anything personally against them. They're just the enemy.
Well, yeah, and like we were talking about last week, a lot of these people were friends before the war.
Yes.
Not necessarily the spies, but the men conducting.
Well, in the spies, the spies were their friends as well. Okay, I mean, these are people from well-known families. All right, that are part of their upper crust societies in both cases. All right. Yeah, they know that they're Southern sympathizers. They know that these people could possibly be. You would think that people would check to say, make sure. But at the same time, it's a gentleman's war. Women were expected to be, seen and not heard. They weren't. They were expected to focus on the genteel arts. Elizabeth Lou, all right, was well known for braving the contempt of her peers and basically going out to where the Union prisoners were hospitalized and helping out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and we'll end up talking about Andersonville and Libby Prison on a future episode. So we will talk about the shit show that is Andersonville.
Well, I mean, we will explain that, but yeah. So, but to be honest, with Elizabeth Van Loo, all right, the fact that they never arrested her is kind of surprising. But the other thing to remember is this: when we say that they're living in the society, they're a part of the society, but how often are they actually interacting with people? How often do you see her roaming around Richmond? Is it every day? No, of course not, because she lives on the farm outside of Richmond, right?
Yeah, so the people are coming to her pretty much. She's not flaunting her Union sympathies necessarily.
Well, with the exception of caring for Union prisoners. But exactly, though, she's not uppermost in their minds when they're talking about other things. Of course, she was also one of the people who was running a cipher out of her home. All right, she kept a cipher key in a case on her watch, in a watch case. All right, she had reports written in invisible ink. All right.
Yeah, actually, that is an interesting aspect of this, and I think as long as you have time, I think we might end up going a bit long on this episode because there's so many interesting aspects to it. Really, isn't that when people started using invisible ink and stuff like that? Didn't that kind of arise out of espionage in the Civil War era?
No, actually, the invisible ink was well known even in the Revolutionary War time frame. They would use types of invisible ink. One of the more unique things in the Civil War or in the Revolutionary War was how they caught what they used to catch Benedict Arnold. And in fact, what's interesting about it, Benedict Arnold is, of course, is his wife was fully one of the spies as well. She, of course, has histrionics, all right, and so they don't arrest her, and they let her get away.
Yeah, doesn't she? She's the one that actually pushes him over the edge. Benedict Arnold, that is, by connecting him with her friend from the English military, right?
Yes,
and kind of sets all that into motion.
She is she's the one who does push him over, playing on his ego, thinking that the rebels have abandoned you, they're worthless, they're not treating you with the respect that you're due, et cetera, et cetera. And she convinces him to basically betray the cause, which is unfortunate.
Yeah,
it's unfortunate not just for the revolution. It's also unfortunate for him himself, because Benedict Arnold really was he was a masterful tactician and a brave soldier, but because he was a traitor, right? The British, of course, never, once a traitor, always a traitor. You're not going to trust a traitor ever. So he was never ever, even when he went back to Great Britain, he was never going to be trusted, all right, with a real command to really command forces in the field again. So
Jensen in the chat says the history of invisible ink goes back more than 2,000 years. It was used by the ancient Greeks and the Romans. Okay, learn something new every day. What about ciphers? I know you brought up that one woman who was a Union spy using a cipher. Did the Confederates use them a lot as well?
Greenhow, in fact, that's how that's one of the ways that Pinkerton was able to confirm that Greenhow was a Southern sympathizer or a Southern spy, because he basically found all the cipher techniques and all the cipher material in her room. So yeah, I mean, ciphers were well known, and they were well used. They're constantly used. Now, the kind of ciphers that they used back then were rolled ciphers. Okay, they would have an encryption, all right, on a roll, and you had to know which line and which version that you were using, which would give you tell you what things were, right? The advantage of doing that, of course, is that if somebody else has a different role or a different, this is one of the ciphers they used, I should say. If they did, another person had a different role, right, or had the same role, was the only way to basically decode it back then. All right, you didn't have the power of computers, the mathematics of cryptology hadn't really come to the forefront yet. Most of the time, they were just writing things and hiding them in various places.
Well, no, and isn't one of the cipher techniques like you have a text or whatever, and you have you pick a letter out of, every 10 is the next letter, and it spells out the
those
message
kind of replacement ciphers were already well known and were easy to defeat. All right, I mean, if you caught somebody that was trying to run a simple cipher like that, which is just a replacement cipher, all right, it wouldn't be long before they could be cracked. Those were already well known and could be cracked easily. So those weren't very often used. All right, that's why they went to the ciphers that were on scrolls or ciphers that are on rolls.
Yeah. Do you think the Pinkerton? Do you think they had the better spy network or the Confederacy? Which one would you say actually had the better spy network?
Pinkerton had a better counter-espionage technique, far superior to anything that the Confederacy ever came up with. The thing is when it came to actual espionage, the fact that it was being run by the government, there was a more consistent flow from the Confederate spies, because it could be from an organizational standpoint. You also got to remember that Pinkerton, I mean, when the second time that McClellan was fired, Pinkerton left, right? So he basically, the Pinkerton agency stopped working, all right, for the Union at that point, all right? So, whereas with the South, I mean, the Southern Confederacy continued its operations to the end, right? So from an organizational standpoint, the Confederacy was far superior. But from a counter-espionage capability, the Union was the Pinkertons were far superior. But that's because they were working as detectives.
Yeah. Also, Jensen, if you would like to jump in, you can. I thought 40 ounce was going to join us today, but he never did. So yeah, you're welcome to jump in. You know where the link is.
By the way, did you put this PDF in the description? Did you link it in the description?
I did, yeah.
Okay, good. I didn't notice that. So, which is really, I would encourage people who want to read it. It's an interesting take. Now, granted, it's from the CIA. but it gives you a historical perspective of how they were looking at things. And it does go into some of these stories, like with Elizabeth Van Loo and so forth. I think one of the things that I find most amusing is some of her agents would carry messages in scraps of paper that they had put in hollowed out eggs, and then mix them in with real eggs, right? So that if you had a basket of eggs, they would look at it as just be a basket of eggs.
Huh, that's actually quite inventive.
Another technique that they would do is they would sew in the paper patterns, all right, from women's dresses, right? They would just sew them in with the inside the dresses, basically.
Oh, yeah, we haven't touched upon this yet. Why not explain a little bit about the Confederate plot to firebomb New York City?
Okay, this is toward the end of the war, right? The Confederacy, many of the Southern sympathizers are very upset because of the damage being done when cities are, taken. Now, for the most part, the damage to the cities is limited unless it was a heavily defended city that took a long time to capture.
I was going to say, don't make me pull up some pictures of Atlanta. Don't make me do it.
Richmond was not Richmond, but Richmond too, but really Vicksburg was just totally destroyed. All right, for all intents and purposes, it was just massive devastation. And so, as a payback, as a punishment, there was a Confederate operation where they were going to go out and they were going to firebomb hotels across the city of New York. Right, this would overwhelm the firefighting operations. All right, they would add to this by actually opening fire in some cases, right, to shoot some of the people trying to stop the fires before they got out of control, in an attempt basically to create a firestorm in the city of New York. Now, the operation went forward. It did take place. There were between 10 to 15 agents, Confederate agents, that were attempting to do this simultaneously. Only many of them, unfortunately, were for the South or the Confederacy, were caught in the act, and their bombs didn't go off. A few of them did. There were a few fires that were started, but they never raged out of control like what was expected. And while some of the people that did conduct the operation did escape, the ringleader, basically was caught, all right, and then later on executed.
And it's a weird choice, though, to choose New York to firebomb, and this is why. Didn't they just have the draft riots around the same time? I mean, like, New York is almost a Confederate city at this point. I mean,
it's also a major mercantile. It's a major industrial area of the North. A lot of industry. It's a major port. A lot of traffic goes in and out of New York. New York is a major hub. It's a major rail hub, right? And it's a major population center. In the North, it is the largest city in the United States, aside from a population standpoint, aside from New Orleans at the time. New Orleans being the most heavily populated city.
I thought Philadelphia had quite a large population as well. But
obviously, Philadelphia has a large population. D.C. has a large population, but at the time, the United States, the largest population was New Orleans, and I think the second largest in an urban area was New York City. Boston had quite a few people at this point. I mean, but they weren't nearly to the degree of the other two, right? In comparison, and I mean, even Atlanta, right, which was the largest city inside of Georgia, right, didn't compare population-wise to New York or to New Orleans.
Well, and I guess now that I'm actually thinking about it, a lot of the Union Army was being pretty much formed out of New York because the Irish immigrants were pretty much coming off the boats and joining up immediately.
Well, I mean,
so
I wouldn't say that the New Yorkers provided the majority of Union troops in any way, shape, or form. They came from all over, right? So I don't think it's that aspect. I think it's more the aspect of, this is a major city. This is the mercantile area. A lot of goods flow in and out of New York. A lot of weapon systems can go in and out of New York. A lot of processed material. You got to remember, this was an industrial center at the time. New York isn't nearly as industrialized as it was during the Civil War, right? These people were working in, the machine shops and so forth. Now, are there machine shops around the country? Of course there are. Cleveland and in Ohio, in the Ohio Basin, it has a lot of these areas, right? But New York does as well, and New York is a major city. So the idea is, okay, it's the jewel of America. Everyone, it's the jewel. It's Wall Street, where a lot of banking and everything else takes place. So it becomes a target point.
Do you think it was mainly out of desperation at this point in the war that they were like, okay, all the gloves are off now? You know what I mean? Like, let's do it.
Desperation and spite is really why they did it. It was desperation and spite. I mean, it's also the fact that what else are you going to do? Honestly, what else can you do? Nothing else that you've done so far. You're not seeing any positive effect, and you're losing the war.
Well, okay. Yeah, and I could think of a few places that might be strategically better to burn. Philadelphia's in Pennsylvania. Maybe light that on fire right before Gettysburg happens. just throwing it out there.
Well, to be able to get down into Philadelphia during that time frame to do it, it would have been a bit more difficult.
Yeah, but the whole point of having a spy network is so you can move assets into areas covertly, obviously.
All right, but okay, so let's say you burnt Philadelphia. Then what? What good would it have done?
I don't know. It would have made people feel better.
Did it?
I just think it's more strategic, though, somewhere closer to the actual fighting than, New York.
Well, from a tactical standpoint, specifically with Gettysburg, yeah. But overall, would it have had any real effect? No. I mean, let's be honest with you. The ability of the rail system in the North is far superior and far more redundant, and far more different ways of moving troops and supplies around than just single, rail lines. So from that standpoint, really, what were you going to gain out of it? You weren't going to gain much of a reprieve. You weren't going to gain much, all right? You didn't have the forces to really hit the industrial areas on a broad scale enough to actually affect the outcome of the war. So what was going to be the point?
Yeah, but what's the point of trying to burn New York? There is no real point.
Well, like I said, it was desperation and revenge.
Well, then you could have the same reasons for burning Philadelphia.
Yeah, and you could have the same reasons then as a response to them trying to burn down frickin' New York. Well, why don't we just burn Charlotte to the ground?
That'll take a lot of tiki torches. Anyway. I had to. It popped in my head. I had to say it.
I wasn't talking about Charlottesville, Virginia. I was talking about Charlotte, North Carolina. But
I know. All right. Interesting. The Torpedo Bureau. The Torpedo Bureau, authorized on October 31st, 1862, was headed by Brigadier General Gabriel Rains. It was charged with production of various explosives, including landmines, naval mines, and coal torpedoes. What's a coal torpedo?
Never heard of a coal torpedo, although I would suspect what it is one of the things people don't realize is how explosive dust can be. I assume that it's something along those lines.
Okay.
Coal dust.
No, there's a little pop-up here. The coal torpedo was a hollow iron casting filled with explosives and covered in coal dust. deployed by the Confederate Secret Service during the American Civil War, and intended for doing harm to Union steam transportation. Okay. Oh, I got it. Yeah, they throw it in with the coal, right? And it blows up the boiler. That's pretty smart.
Well, it starts a fire in the coal chutes. But the thing is like I said, with coal dust, it's a dust explosive is what it is. All right, it's an attempt to sit up there and cause a fire and so forth in the coal areas. All right, which would be very difficult, of course, to put out right away. And even if you did put it out right away, you just basically, threw a bunch of probably salt water on a bunch of coal, right, in order to put it out, making the coal. You'd have to wait for it to dry out before you could even attempt to try and burn it. So it basically would make it kind of useless in that kind of thing. But the idea behind a lot of these quote unquote torpedoes or mines were basically to mine bridges and so forth, right? Try and take down bridges, take down, rail bridges, rail trains, trestles, things like that. I mean, that's generally what the attempt of those torpedoes were to do. They were basically the ordnance corps, all right, attempting to say, okay, the demolition groups that are supposed to go in there, right? How effective was it going to be, right? Once again, when you're talking about tactical movements, can you delay somebody's movement that way? Yeah, but overall, is it really going to have much of an effect? Well, if you can't coordinate it, you can't coordinate the movement or anything, how effective was it really going to be? At most, it was an effective delaying tactic, all right, really for the South, not so much for the North, because the North has so many other ways to move around. The rail lines are there's very few points in the rail system where there's a single point of failure can stop all movement. You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
how
absolutely.
effective was it ever going to be? I mean, you'd have to coordinate something like that with military movement and coordinate the detonations simultaneously. And even then, even when you disrupted it from a train standpoint, it's like, okay, well, we've got to get across the trail. Does it delay things? Maybe an hour as people got to get off of this train, walk across the whatever pontoon area was quickly thrown across, and back onto another train and sent back over. So maybe 8 hours, a delay of 8 hours. Could it be significant from a tactical perspective? Yeah, but from a strategic perspective, was it ever going to change the war? No.
Well, it seems to me that the Confederate Secret Service was trying to use all these different tactics to kind of shore up their inherent weakness, which was the fact that they were outnumbered and outsupplied by the enemy.
I think that they were doing it because you had people that were Southern sympathizers in the North that felt like they had to do something when they weren't actually going to join the actual battlefield. And so they did it to say, look, I'm doing my part.
Yeah, more out of guilt of or.
Oh yeah, I mean, let's be perfectly honest. John Wilkes Booth didn't join the Confederate, didn't go south to become a soldier. He didn't want to do that, right? And he felt guilty about it. It's one of the reasons why he took the action he did. He felt like he was useless.
Do you think it was cowardice?
Cowardice. I don't think it was cowardice in regards to worrying about getting shot so much as cowardless in that, okay, I don't know what's going to happen, right? For example, John Wilkes Booth was what? He was a well-known actor, right? If he sat there and joined the South, he would no longer be an actor in the North, right? So his job and everything else were no longer going to be available to him. Was he ever going to be an actor again? Well, it would be very difficult to know when he could become an actor again. So it would be to say that he was a coward in that regard. You could say that he was a moral coward. He wasn't willing to take the risk, but is that really cowardice, or is that just him making a decision that says, you know what, this is going to be best for me, and then later on regretting that decision because, let's be honest, it's hubris in a certain way, in that, okay, well, if only I had joined earlier, I could have been a part of this, right? maybe I could have made a difference if I'd have joined at the very beginning. Maybe if
Yeah.
more like me, I think it's a lot of guilt that goes along with it for making the previous decision. But the reason they made the decisions at the time was like actual cowardness. I don't want to say that it was actual cowardice. It was a, you know, a view that was like, okay, well, I mean, everyone. I'll be perfectly frank. At the beginning of the war, everyone expected the war to last maybe 6 months to a year, with the exception. There were very few exceptions, both North and South. I mean, they were expecting the war to be a short affair, right? Very few. I mean, this is one of the reasons why everyone thought that Sherman was a nut when he said this is not going to be a short war and it's going to be brutal and people are going to be horrified about it. That's one of the reasons they thought he was freaking off his rocker.
Yeah, they really did think he was crazy. I think a lot of it, though, when it comes to like John Wilkes Booth, at least, you know, he was an actor. He probably didn't want to go through what you have to go through to be a soldier. You know what I mean?
I'm sure that that's a part of it. I'm sure the fact that he probably didn't like taking orders. You know, he did not come from that part of society. I mean, let's be honest. He could mix in high society as an actor in a way that he couldn't mix in high society in any other form. And was he going to be? Let's be honest. Were they going to pick him out as an officer? Would he have been an officer in the Confederate service? Not likely. He probably would have had to start as a private. You know, and that to him he may have looked at that as being a come down. You know, I mean, here I am mixing it up with high society, and now all of a sudden I'm just a know nothing, you know, farming private. And
Yeah.
that was important to those people back then. I mean, that's how society gauged itself. That's how people looked upon their worth. It wasn't so much how much wealth you had; it was what was your social standing, more than anything else. Especially in the South, especially the Southerners.
Well, no, and I don't think John Wilkes Booth had any military experience whatsoever. You're right; he would have started off at the bottom.
Well, he was at one point. He was part of one of the Virginia militia groups, but that's about the most experience he ever had. Now, was he just a buck private? Probably. You know, I can't imagine him thinking he's going to parlay that into being a general or a major or something like that.
So this Wikipedia page is also trying to say that the revenue runners, you know, the blockade runners, were part of the Confederate Secret Service. I don't necessarily consider them spies. Yeah, they were not flying, you know, the Confederate flag. You know, they probably had quite a few different flags on any ship that they were using, but that doesn't necessarily make them a spy, right?
I don't think so. No. I mean, a blockade runner is not part of it wasn't organized. It wasn't part of the organized operations by the Confederate Secret Service. That's one thing that's very true. The blockade runners, well, there may have been specific ones that were used for the couriers and stuff, but overall, were they part of the service? No, they were not. Were they used by some of the agents of the Confederacy? Yeah, but they in and of themselves may or may not have been agents.
Well, they were definitely used by a couple agents that left and went to Great Britain. But other than that, yeah, I don't consider them a part of the spy networks at all. So we're going to disregard the blockade runners for the sake of time.
Of course, the other aspect that we haven't talked into at all is the Union and their use of the black dispatches. And
go ahead and elaborate.
What the black dispatches basically were basically the former and runaway slaves that were providing information, all right, to the Union and Union troops. All right. And this was something that was a problem for the South, no matter where they went, was when the Union forces arrived, there were the slaves and the former slaves were willing to tell the Union soldiers about anything like troop movements or anything that they may have overheard in passing, or even, I mean, for whatever reason, the Southerners overall treated the slaves as if they didn't exist and would talk openly about military operations in front of the slaves. Now, you would think that they would have had a better sense than that, but they didn't have better sense than that. They constantly were underestimating, like they said, even to the point where the Union had a spy. One of the slaves was in the actual Confederate White House. Was providing information. It's that arrogant disregard for what was going on.
Do you think that was just the Southern culture?
I do think it's part of the Southern culture. I think that's one of the blind spots that did live. I don't think it was part. I think it was. Well, let me put it this way. Let me change that. I think it was part of the upper class Southern culture that it was their attitude. Like one of the Confederate generals basically made, or I think it was the Secretary of War. Confederate Secretary of War basically said, if the black troops, right, or the Negroes, right, make good soldiers, if they are awesome soldiers, we've made a mistake. Our view of the blacks then is completely wrong.
Well, and that's why. Well, no, and that's why my argument is at the end of the war, when Davis frees the slaves and makes them soldiers, he is pretty much sacrificing that aspect of Southern culture for independence.
Yeah, but it's too little, too late. Far too little, far too late. And let's be perfectly honest. Would South Carolina had joined a confederacy that was going to free the slaves?
If that was okay at the very beginning, if that immediately happened, no, South Carolina wasn't. Neither would Mississippi. Louisiana probably would. They had a high population of freed men of color that actually owned slaves. But that was the exception to the rule, not the rule.
Exactly. North Carolina probably, who knows what North Carolina probably wouldn't have, because Virginia wouldn't have. All right, and that's the thing. All right, I mean, you probably would not have had the secession take place the way it did if that was going to be the case at the beginning of the war. Texas the same way. Texas never would have joined a confederacy that was going to free the slaves. In fact, a lot of the Texas Revolution revolved around the fact that they wanted to keep their slaves.
Yeah, it is Santa Anna. Pretty much take away slavery or whatever.
Well, in Mexico, slavery was deemed illegal, right? They were. It was going to be free, whether the Americans that were existing in the Mexican territory liked it or not. And that is one of the bugaboos. All right. I mean, it really was one of the bugaboos. A lot of people don't realize that many of the people that they talk about, like Jim Bowie, right, actually considered himself willing to be a Mexican citizen, not an American. He was willing to be a Mexican citizen. All right. He wanted to be part of Mexico. He just wanted to make sure that there was not an attempt to free slaves.
Yeah, well, Mexico pretty much asked for that revolution. Okay, they begged the Americans to come and settle in the territory, and then they're like, "Wait a minute, there's too many of you." I mean,
well, not only are there too many of you, you're taking the best land, and you're actually making a go of it in some of these areas, and now we're jealous, and we're gonna tax you, and oh by the way, we're gonna take away your slaves. So,
and no more. And no more migrating into the territory. If you're here, you can stay. Other than that, stay the fuck out.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a turbulent time in the Mexican history anyway. Right? I mean, Mexico has a number of revolutions that take place prior to the establishment of what we consider the Mexican government today. I mean, things have changed dramatically from that time frame. So, I mean, it was a different aspect. It was a different world then. But Texas would have, I guarantee you, Texas would never have joined the Confederacy if the Confederacy was even thinking about actually freeing the slaves prior to declaring themselves, a free state or whatever.
Yeah, well, one thing I find interesting, if the South would have won, I wonder if Lee would have been the next president. We'll never know, but just a thought. I don't know.
There's no way that Robert E. Lee would have ran for president.
You don't think so? I don't. I think they would implore upon him to run, kind of like they did Washington.
It would have been awful difficult. Because he had no desire to be in that role in any way, shape, or form. He really didn't. I don't think that Robert E. Lee really desired to be. I mean, he always looked at himself totally as a military officer. Washington looked at himself as a gentleman. Or I mean, he had other aspirations rather than being a military officer. Robert E. Lee was military officer through and through.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else about? I mean, there's no way we covered everything about the spies of the Civil War, but there's no way we could do that unless we have 10 hours to freaking talk about it. Anything?
We haven't finished the Civil War yet.
Yeah.
Of American history can be put on a postage stamp. But no, I don't have anything else. I mean, there's a lot of little anecdotes and little stories that are talking about. Another thing that we hadn't mentioned before was the Great Train Chase. I mean, we mentioned it before, but that was also considered part of the spying that was going on, because several of them were executed as spies, actually, by the Confederacy. So, I mean, they weren't part of it wasn't part of a Pinkerton operation or anything like that. However, I mean, it was.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot of times that people would consider the partisans as spies as well, because they would fade back into the civilian population after they conducted their raids.
Right.
So, if they were ever caught, like even after the end of the war, they couldn't go surrender, especially not the ones out of Missouri. They had to go deep in the South to go surrender.
Well, I mean, to some degree, yeah, but I mean, those are special cases. There's a lot about it. I really did enjoy reading the PDF that you've linked to. I encourage anybody that's listening to this to look at that PDF, and you can read about the personal stories of several of these people that we've mentioned, and even some others that we've actually failed to mention and talk about.
Yeah, actually, there's one more person we need to talk about before we wrap it up. We never touched upon Harriet Tubman. Why was she considered a spy? Because she ran the Underground Railroad? Was it as simple as that, or was she doing other operations?
Well, she was part of the courier operations. I mean, it was her liaisons in a lot of cases she would go across to try and free slaves, of course, but she would also bring back intelligence that she was part of the Black Dispatch Group. All right, she would bring back intelligence and give it to the Union commanders, all right, that she was working with. So she would get intelligence from, traveling around in the South, all right, helping, and she would help slaves, of course, escape, but she would also then bring back information about troop movements and logistical supply areas that were going on from the South. They would also bring back, papers, the local papers from all these different regions, so that people could read in the papers of what was going on if there was anything militarily relevant that was going on.
Yeah, and how often did the northern newspapers actually discuss troop movements and stuff?
All the time.
I know. Okay, I was gonna say I know the Richmond papers discussed it all the time.
Yeah, they both sides their papers would constantly talk about who is visiting who and which general was where, all sorts of stupid shit.
Yeah, it seems like you're shooting yourself in the foot at that point. Even if you're the paper, yeah, people want to read about it. But if you're a pro-secessionist paper, why are you writing down troop movements?
Americans are a yappy group of people. The British will tell you, the American troops, the Americans are a yappy group of people. We talk all the time. In fact, we never shut up. We're not a disciplined group. We never have been. So in the Union papers and the Southern papers constantly were relating what was going on in the local area, right? People, I mean, people think of the papers today, and they think of the major papers. They think of the New York Times, et cetera, right? Come from small town America, okay? In the small town that I grew up in Wisner, Nebraska, right? They would put a paper out once a week. I don't remember what they called the Wisner paper off the top of my head, all right? But in the Wisner paper, and my parents got it weekly, right? They would have things telling you about who was visiting who was playing bridge with who, all right? All right, this is what the paper was like, all right? Yeah, it would have other events and other things that were going on, upcoming events, what this festival was like, St. Patrick's Day is coming, where to go to find things, who stole the Blarney Stone, all the little incidents that were going on in inside of town, But they would go to the point of, like I said, where these people played bridge with such and such, and this is how many tricks they won, and all this stuff. All right, local 4-H group would have things. This is what was going on in the local papers. This was local news. I mean, they're, for all intents and purposes, they're gossip rags, and they haven't changed.
No, you have a point. I remember in Junction City, they have the Tri-County Tribune or whatever. It comes out once a week. And I only ever read that for the police reports. Oh, look, there's a spike in freaking car break-ins this last week.
I guess they noticed me. Anyway. So, but no, yeah.
Hush, MC. Hush.
So, but no, what was going on in the local papers was always looked upon as a great source of news. It's also one of the reasons why Sherman hated them. He considered newspapermen to be spies anyway.
Well, no, and I think it's really interesting if any of these guys, like especially Jefferson Davis, would have had 2 brain cells in his head. He could have figured out there's probably spies around here. Maybe I should put out some misinformation and, clog up the spy network with fake news. That's a good point. Yeah, good point.
The society that we live in today is not the society that they lived in at that time. So that would be considered, how uncouth would that be to lie? Are you kidding me? Why would
especially for
my personal honor is at stake here, sir. My personal honor.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, especially for a quote-unquote Southern gentleman like, Davis. There's no way he's going to go around lying all day.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was...
But, no, we've gone about an hour and a half. I figure last thoughts here, and we'll wrap it up. We'll be back tomorrow for the Monday news.
So, do you want to do a show next week?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering, should we just dig into Gettysburg and get it over with?
Or should they keep dangling it out like the festering wound I could do it? No, we'll go into Gettysburg. I think Gettysburg, it's time for Gettysburg.
All right. Hopefully we can get 40 ounce on board for the Gettysburg episode. That'll be next Sunday. Like I said, we're going to do the news tomorrow. And Tuesday, I might just do a show, maybe. I have winter break coming up, so I might just do a Tuesday show.
Okay.
But please like and subscribe. Hit up the Discord links down there. The source material is down there as well, other than the Wikipedia article. I mean, anybody can find a wiki. Are you going to be doing any more rants tomorrow morning or what?
Oh, I'll do my morning rant in the morning. Yeah, Monday morning, 7 o'clock.
All right.
My time.
All right, awesome.
Which is 6 o'clock your time, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm asleep at that time. But good night, everybody. We're out of here. Peace.